Greetings, Eigen family. So we just have this intro audio only, but there is video for the rest of the podcast, so don't worry. We just have not as great audio because we lost the audio for us.
Yes.
But it should be bearable, so stick with it.
Yeah, this was our return to co-streaming.
Co-streaming, yes. We had a little bit of technical issues, but the podcast should be pretty good. So our guest today is Wilfred Reilly. He's a associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University. He's got a PhD from Southern Illinois University, a law degree from University of Illinois. He's written a couple books. The most recent ones being...
Hold on, problematic light alert.
Huh? Problematic what?
Problematic light alert. his two books.
The names.
Because I even told him this when you hear the podcast.
One thinks they're salacious.
They are salacious titles, bro.
His 2019 book is the Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War, and his second book is called Taboo. So if you haven't guessed yet, yes, he is a sociology political guy. So this is a little bit
as he claimed, self-proclaimed right leaning.
Yes, center right leaning.
Yeah.
So we got him on here though because he likes to describe himself as does empirical testing of political claims. So Wilfred Reilly's a real smart guy. Hopefully you guys will enjoy this one.
Yeah. So Terence really reached out. Did you reach out to him?
Yeah.
Yeah. Terence reached out to him. He likes his stuff, and so I was like, all right, Terence, are you gonna get us canceled on this podcast? Getting a guy who has a book, but honestly, he was very measured. I went in there being like, "Damn, bro, you're poking the hornet's nest."
Yeah, Juan was a little bit
titles
scared
like that
because he had some things for PragerU, but
yeah, I was like,
he's a legit guy.
So if you're anything like me and you heard those book titles and were like, okay, here we go. But he actually was. He came. Obviously, he's a professor, so he knows his stuff, and so it was a good discussion. I think very interesting, and yeah, he was a good guest.
All right, yeah. So guys, just make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe as normal. Check out Eigenbros.com. Check out Eigenbros on Twitter, Eigenbros Instagram, and Eigenbros2 on TikTok. And thank you, patron supporters, once again. We appreciate you guys. And stay tuned.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I want to add one more thing. If you feel like maybe we can have a balanced, if you feel like we can have a balanced discussion, me and Terence, we approach all angles. So if you would like, please drop a person that you think is also good. That's a good counterpoint. We'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Thank you, folks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, good to be here. See you guys bringing in the social science for an episode. Look forward to talking to you.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, we're honored to have you on here, man. You've got some fire tweets, I gotta say.
Terence, I mentioned it to Will, but Terence was like, we gotta talk about the elephant in the room, and Terence agrees a lot with your takes, and I'm like, okay, let's hear it. I want to see what's going on.
But what's the elephant?
No, race. In politics and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, that's like a really hot topic, and like the thing that I saw was like, okay, Wilfred, he's got a book called your 2019 book. Yeah,
Hate Crime Hoax.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, what a salacious title. Like, how did you? Like, you're smiling, so I'm wondering how did.
Well, the short answer to that is that as the author of a book, you don't pick the title of the book and you don't pick the cover art for the book. Although I did like that. I mean, this is a long-running thing. Like, if you ever talk to anyone who's on the science fiction side, and a lot of people in what I understand to be you guys field dabble in that. Like, when you've got the front cover of the book with, like, the Amazon bending over in chainmail, like, holding two swords, like, the author, who's, a historian with a PhD, didn't necessarily pick that. For me, I have a good relationship with my publisher, Regnery, which is a large right-leaning publisher. But Hate Crime Hoax comes out of an actual data set that I have that's very wonky, pretty scientific. I mean, it's going up on my website. Anyone who wants to can see it. And the original title for the book that I proposed was something pretty neutral, the increasing prevalence of blank. And Regnery was like, no, I mean, the whole point of selling a book is that you're going to move, 100,000 units rather than getting 250 downloads of your dissertation. So, we're going to go with the front covers like a burning church. And this is a very serious publisher. But I mean, that's the art, and the title is, it's Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Now, I definitely think the woke left is one of the most irritating, useless movements in modern society, but we'll say the final chapter or two of the book look at almost equally prevalent hoaxes from what at the time would probably have been called the alt-right. I mean, there was a wave of cops for a while claiming that they had been subjected to just this offensive stuff, like their police cars had been set on fire, tampons had been dropped into their coffee. And just as with the leftists, I kind of asked, like in the second case, like, wouldn't you notice that? I mean, wouldn't that be something you'd be able to detect? And it turned out a lot of those as well. I don't know. I mean, I assume the tampon case is one of them, but certainly like the burning police vehicle thing turned out to be a straight up hoax. Like the officer was arrested. So yeah, I mean, the book itself is pretty broad. It's gotten excellent reviews, professionally and publicly. But yeah, the title's entertaining. The other one, Taboo, I will note, like I'm from a city, I've partied for a couple of years. I mean, the cover of that one is a bondage mask. So like they wanted something dramatic to go along with the topic 10 facts you can't talk about. And I think they Googled taboo or restrained or something like that. And they came with one of those full face white leather masks, like seals over the eyes and so on. And again, like both books, they're noticeable on the shelf. But yeah, that getting to the point, that is generally a publisher decision.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I'm like, that's one thing that kind of grabs people from, I would say, both political spectrums. You know what I mean? Like if like to pull you in essentially is what you're saying. Like it's like it pulls eyes and it's sort of a marketing thing. But I kind of wanted to lay that out because I'm like, okay, it's important for people to distinguish these things. Because you studied this and as a you said you did your PhD in this, correct?
Well, no, my PhD is in political science broadly from Southern Illinois, and my three subfields for those in or near the discipline were public law, international relations, and political theory. But my dissertation actually is what kind of got me into this sector. Like, without giving the full cocktail party pitch, I mean, there's a very well-known political scientist named Andrew Hacker. He does good work. But one of his sideline experiments in 1992, he's a man of the political left, and he asked a bunch of white kids how much money they'd have to be paid to be black. This is him teaching in, I think, NYU or Queens U. And the average answer was $50 million. And this is probably one of the most famous experiments in that kind of white privilege space where someone actually tested this. I've had it cited to me talking about my research now probably 50 or 60 times, apparently by people who didn't know what my dissertation subject was. But it struck me that he hadn't asked any black men or Asians, Hispanics, any women. One, do you think this question is silly or real? Would you ever consider changing your race or sex if this were possible, even given some sort of advanced technology? And two, if you would, how much would you charge for that? How much would you demand? And I actually, at this time, I was a graduate student. Most of my friends are probably upper middle class, minority males. And once in the gym, we were just goofing around. We were playing pickup basketball. And I asked some of them this, and they were like, 80 million to become white. And people were engaging in the same sort of stereotypical behavior, like they can't cook. Would I be a worse dancer or lover? Like people are talking trash. Like two white guys were there getting a little irritated. And it was just like, well, we're having fun now, but this is an interesting topic. Like, do these things that are just coming from the left in sociology or the right in military science, what would happen if you just did the exact opposite experiment? Like there are all these tests of how hard it is to get hired by like private sector, small white companies as a black guy. How easy is it to get hired by a private sector, small black or Asian company as a white guy? I mean, we're now quite competitive in that sector. That's 30% of business. So just to say one of those results and not the other is wildly incomplete. It ignores the fact that there's an enormous advantage the other group has, in the next neighborhood over. So, I mean, but anyway, the dissertation just is a formalized version of that. I asked several thousand people, would you ever consider changing your core identities? And I found some interesting stuff. If you use that as a definition of racism, which I don't, both blacks and Asians are more racist than whites. Hispanics aren't, interestingly enough. Hispanics tend to think of racism as a little silly. But all groups demanded.
Woo! No, I'm just kidding.
No, but I mean, like the one thing a lot of Latino guys said was, well, you know, so some of this seems almost primitive to us because you can be black, white, etc., Indio, and be Hispanic. Middle Easterners said the same thing. So it's kind of like this is your fight over here in like the Northern West. It's worth noting those two groups were the most prejudiced about religion, though. Like Muslims and Catholic Hispanics absolutely refused to change faith, which I threw in as kind of a control and said we were all a bunch of, you know, ecumenical savages if you were willing to. So everyone has their prejudices. But that dissertation, I think, kind of led into some of this stuff, like the hate crime hoax thing. I mean, I'm from Chicago. If you recall the media there, I mean, Jussie Smollett was from Chicago. The Wisconsin Parkside case was from Chicago. You know, Velvet Ultra Lounge was from Chicago. And I wondered how many of these cases that turn out to be fakes, obviously that's not the majority of hate crimes, but how many of these are there? And I wrote a book about it, and the number is thousands. I mean, it's very substantial. So that became the book Hate Crime Hoax.
Yeah, I think you actually said, or at least your Wikipedia said that you found that there was about 409, I believe. Let me just make sure I got the number right. Yeah, you said there were about 409 cases that you found that were reported that were hoaxes, and that was out of 5 years, I believe. And
concentrated in 5 years. I mean, there were, just to be honest, there were incidents like Tawana Brawley outside that time frame. But I mean, what I did, like, so there were several layers of research for the book, but the one that's actually used for the book is to some extent very simple. I mean, it's quantitative research, but just document analysis. I used Google Scholar, JSTOR. I'm skilled with all those tools to look up phrases like fake hate crime and see how many of these I could find. And I set a window, which is it was sort of the last 5 years plus famous cases. I mean, so that's not a rock hard bar. But within that time period, which I guess would have been primarily like late 2013 to 2019, if you look at what's in the book, I found 409 independent case studies of hate crime hoaxing, as I defined it. And by the way, this does have to be, I've gotten some questions about this at academic events and so on. This does have to be a pretty substantial percentage of the hate crimes. That's not kind of my job. I mean, there are people, Dr. Levin comes to mind, who look at this professionally, but there aren't that many hate crimes. I mean, there are only about 7,000 hate crimes in a typical year. And another caveat is that I'm using only incidents, and this list is available to anyone who wants it when you talk about contacting me through Twitter and so on. I'm using only incidents that were reported regionally or nationally as a hate incident, and then that were reported regionally or nationally as debunked, just so there's no debate about what do you call a hoax, so on. So that's about a tenth, it's about 11% of all hate crimes. So that takes you down to about 700 nationally reported hate crimes in a year. You're talking about a period of less than a decade, and you're talking about finding about 500 prominent hoaxes. So that is a remarkable number. And I would assume that if you're looking at the more prominent cases, they would be more concentrated there. I mean, when you look at the most notable, most media promoted incidents of hate crime, they tend to be very dramatic. They tend to involve the old school sort of white and black guy fighting in the street with bats. And very many of them tend to turn out to be fake. So like Jussie Smollett, Juicy Smollett, the mad Frenchman, as Dave Chappelle roasted him. I mean, that did not occur. You know, Covington Catholic, I think it's more an incident than a crime. But the claim that these prep school athletes had surrounded this literal Native American Indian elder, and they chanted things like build the wall, which is pretty damn ironic to say to an Indian. I mean, they tried to take his sacred drum away. That didn't happen. You know, Erica Thomas, Duke Lacrosse. You could just go on and on with this Air Force Academy where a general came to campus and gave this speech against racism. It turns out that they still have a pretty brutal hazing environment in the military schools. Now, that's a different issue. But this was just a cadet that was upset. Kansas State, you know, these disgusting slurs keep showing up on my luxury vehicle. I mean, that's enough of them. But like when you think of the incidents you've seen prominently featured, like they cut off my dreadlocks in D.C., fight between white and black students, whether or not the fight ever occurred, that incident did not. Notably, the person still had hair when they were claiming that it had happened. That's what first turned me on, made me a little suspicious. But anywho, that is the first book, just looking at this. And I think more importantly, from that public intellectual or that social science standpoint, breaking down why people do this. Like, why does this almost always happen on campuses? That's a real question.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to ask you. I wanted to see, is there a particular instance that you've noticed, a pattern that you've seen where there's a particular type of hoaxing going on? Like, is it usually reported by media outlets? Is it usually reported by the actual individuals themselves? Like, what is the biggest hoax that
There's
you've
one
seen?
there's one very prominent pattern. I mean, there are some smaller patterns in the data. And again, since even, 409 case studies maybe maps 1,000 individual cases, that's still a pretty small in data set. I'd be careful about some of that. Like, I did find that Muslim Americans were the group most likely to engage in hate crime hoaxes, well ahead of blacks or right-wing whites, the people that came behind them. I thought that was interesting. That I suspect is probably kind of situational. I mean, we spent most of the past 10, 15 years in armed conflict with the Muslim world that has produced some real prejudice of a kind you rarely see from, say, blacks toward Asians or something. So maybe that's a backlash to that. So there were some secondary things you could maybe get a paper out of or just find interesting. But there was one overwhelming pattern, and that was that this took place on the university academic campus. I mean, if you go to, I used a separate database. It's very different from mine, which is www.fakehatecrimes.org to kind of fact check my data set. Like, am I just imagining this, or are there quite a few of these out there? And if you go through the first 10 pages of that site, which is where the most prominent cases are, so on, almost half of them, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but took place on a university campus. And I think we left senior high school out of that analysis, so that would be even more of them, but took place on a campus. And I don't think it's really hard to figure out why if you've been to a contemporary American university. I mean, this is where kind of the woke movement has really taken shape, where you have the majors and the different studies fields. I mean, you have kind of a right-wing backlash now from academics like Lindsay and Pluckrose that are sort of mocking this. You have these student activist groups. So, I mean, even on a smaller campus, you have marches every week or two. And these are directed at things like oppression in Palestine that might not be all that relevant to life on the campus itself, but that create kind of this image of social conflict. So, I mean, very many of the most bizarre incidents were academic. I mean, there was one campus, I think it was Oberlin, where there were multiple. In fact, I know this was Oberlin for at least one of these. There were these reports of the Ku Klux Klan popping up on campus. And it just struck me as extraordinarily unlikely. Like, what are the odds that in a left-leaning city in the urban Midwest, this would be happening? And it turned out that all the incidents were, in fact, fakes. Like, one was a woman who was embarrassed. She had hooked up with someone a bit early in the relationship and, like, put a sheet over herself and was walking home. And the idea was we saw a Klansman here. I think it was a different campus, but it may have been the same one, where someone confused lab equipment that was covered with sheets. In like a well-run lab, they'd put the drapes on the Bunsen burners and so on before night fell. That was confused with a Klan meeting taking place. So there were a lot of these incidents of incredible sensitivity. And none of this am I making up or exaggerating. I mean, there were a couple with nooses. These are different campuses now, but like where rope would be left hanging in a construction site and the police would be called, which is one of the cutoffs for a lot of these to be included. And there'd be this furor, the campus paper would report on it, and it would turn out this is literally just a piece of rope. We actually saw that go national with, Bubba Wallace, who claimed that he found a noose in his garage, and it turned out to be like the gee rope that's used to shut the garage. And when I was listening to the FBI talk about this, I mean, they were saying things like trying to be as sensitive as possible. Like, there are only 8 or 9 ways to tie a rope unless you're in the Navy. I mean, like one of them is to tie it with a slip knot and have a little hole at the bottom so you can put something in the rope. And every time you see this, you can't imagine that white supremacists have been involved. I mean, and I thought that was just a hilarious conversation. But we've seen a lot of that and a lot of other similar incidents on academic campuses. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. That's an environment where victimization is likely to be rewarded. That's an environment where you have a large sort of DIE sector, diversity, inclusion, equity. But whatever the reason, I mean, that's a very notable trend.
Very interesting. You bring up a lot of interesting points there. And I think I've seen, of course, I don't know nearly to the depth that you do, but I've noticed these patterns a lot myself. I don't know if Juan would agree necessarily, but I've definitely noticed a lot of the movements and things with the whole woke movements and BLM and such seems Wilfred's giving the power symbol there.
Right.
They seem a little bit overblown to me, and of course that's not really popular to say right now, because it's just one of these touchy issues, and actually you talk about it in your book Taboo, which is I imagine, I haven't read your book Taboo, but I imagine it's covering these very topics. I wondered, Wilfred, do you have any reason or do you know why these issues seem to be so overblown now?
Well, I mean, I'm probably about center right, but I lean right myself, so this is my personal perspective. Everyone has a bias. But I mean, one of the reasons for this, I think, is that there's a very large infrastructure in American society that depends, without getting conspiratorial, on the existence of continued racial and class conflict. I mean, other than a fairly weak diversity rationale, that's the justification almost entirely for affirmative action programs, which every university engages in, speaking as a tenured academic, as you guys know, though, at a very large scale. I mean, it's the justification for minority set-asides, and I think especially prominently, it's the justification for the very large budgets for the leading quote-unquote activist groups. So if you look at, I did some research for Taboo to see how much money was being taken in connection with this argument that like the old wars never ended, that we're still at one another's throats. And it's in the tens of billions. I mean, The Economist recently ran a piece where they define Black Lives Matter a little vaguely here. I'd say this is closer to 7 or 8 billion. But they estimated the amount of money that had gone into all BLM-connected charities and foundations, like BLM Global Foundation, at around $10.6 billion. That is since the Ferguson riots in 2015. But again, that's The Economist, easily searchable article. Very skilled team they put on that. That's a lot of money. Even if you take just an individual organization like the foundation itself or like the Southern Poverty Law Center, I mean, SPLC's endowment, not annual take, but endowment last year was $470 million. And that's a bit more than the endowment for the state university that I teach at. I mean, to put it in that kind of context, I mean, that would be a hit of K-State, a hit of Southern Illinois, a little behind the University of Illinois. You're getting into billions when you get into the Ivy League, of course. But I mean, I think that one of the reasons that this continues is that there are a lot of people that have a vested interest in it continuing. Like Al Sharpton's a little old school. I don't know how much influence he has in the field these days. He's on MSNBC, which is itself crazy. But I mean, there are a lot of young guns in this sector, like Patrice Cullors, Sean King, DeRay McKesson, just guys, you know, just from bantering on Twitter, that are kind of leading that next wave forward. So I think there's a considerable amount of interest in the old explanations not going away. And I mean, of course, you know, one of the things that keeps us going is that there is some racism. I mean, Americans, we're a very diverse country. We do sometimes come into conflict with one another. But I think that the extent to which this is prevalent in my life as a middle to upper middle class minority citizen, quite possibly you guys would say the same, is dramatically overstated or exaggerated. So like the one thing I say, I do a lot of talking to men's groups, athletic teams, and other minority colleges. Like I'm a pretty pro-black guy. I mean, I decided to teach at a historically black college for a reason. But when I do that, I always open with just one comment, which is, or a question really, like how many brothers, how many unarmed black men do you think are killed by police in a typical year? And the estimates that I usually get from these sort of young black audiences are on the order of 3,000. 3,000 to 4,000, but closer to the lower end. And the actual figure, the number of unarmed black men killed specifically by police last year, according to the Washington Post, not some right-wing outlet, was 14. So I think that there's an enormous overhyping of this small number of incidents in order to give kind of power base to some of these groups that have been around since the 1960s and that did an incredible amount of good then, but are no longer as necessary. I mean, we still have, I actually am a member of the NAACP. They still do a lot of economic good, but in terms of organizing marches against racism, is there still the same need for that? Maybe not. I mean, I mentioned the SPLC, there's the CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, that now does this on the Muslim American front. I mean, there are the dozens of Black Lives Matter chapters, associated kind of parasitical groups like Black Bloc, what's sometimes called Antifa. I mean, all of that has something to gain in this conversation. So I do think the numbers are a little the numbers are crazily overstated in the woke movement. Of course, racism is bad, but is there ongoing police genocide or race war? No. And so I think as academics, when people make these claims, it's important not just to say, okay, I'll let the cocktail party go on in peace. I'm not going to argue with this guy. This is the equivalent of the craziest stuff on the right. Like if you think the number of people killed in interracial crime is 3,000 and it's 10, I mean, people do need to correct you and say, no, they're 10 people. That's all I got.
Yeah, you got some really good points there, Wilfred.
Well, I kind of want to interject because, like, I think like with Black Lives Matter, I think it's an important movement in the sense that like it is directed towards race, like solving racial issues, but to me it's more of it's almost like an amalgamation of a movement now. It's like it's an umbrella thing for criminal justice reform in some ways, and I think like yeah, like racism is prevalent. I think people in the millennial generation, I think we didn't necessarily like grow up with a lot of the, how would you say, the like prejudices and
kind of stuff, and
right, with the prejudices of like the civil rights era and stuff, like how
Sure.
people grew up in the 70s and in that era. We come out of that in a world where I guess you could say legally post-racism, you know what I mean, like post-systemic racism, and I use that like, you know, tongue in cheek, but it's like I think reading about it in textbooks and then still seeing it, at least for me as a kid, and then seeing it, you know, seeing police brutality and stuff like that, I think it's a useful, like, it's useful to take a step back, at least for me, and say like, okay, even when I hear statistics like this, like, okay, even if it's in 14
unarmed black men killed by police.
like that's still to me like a significant thing enough to say we need criminal justice reform regardless. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's and yes, some of it might be rooted in racism, but it's like it's still important, I guess, to have this discussion.
I guess I'm also curious, Wilfred. Do you happen to know the number of non-black?
Yeah, of course.
Unarmed people were killed?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, Juan's point, I mean, that's a solid argument. I mean, so a lot of things, there's not really necessarily one right answer. Like someone who's not racist and leans right might come to one conclusion. Someone who's not racist and leans left might come to another conclusion. So, I mean, one thing that I think there's also too much useless passion and anger in a lot of these debates, when very often you could kind of cut the cake in half and work out an actual solution. And I think that comes from having a business perspective. And again, just to throw a dart here, I don't think like the Reverend Al or Sean King or any of these guys want to meet halfway and come up with a solution, because that would turn the money hose off. And I mean, they're guys like that. I mean, there are a lot of grifters left and right. I mean, this is kind of the year of the grifter, where who is it? Hotep Nation put together a podcast, The Grifties, where they held this election for Grifter of the Year with tens of thousands of internet votes, and the nominees went from like Richard Spencer through like Candace Owens over to BLM. I mean, like I think Snoop got nominated. So that's my take on a lot of this. I don't really think people are trying to work toward intelligent solutions, but I will respond to some of the things that were said there in terms of why people might disagree. One, first of all, yeah, I do know the number of non-unarmed and non-black people killed by the police, as you guys asked, and yeah, it's much larger. The number of unarmed non-black people killed in a typical year is 50 to 70, as versus 10 to 20 for black people. That's not even dramatically disproportionate, given slightly but definitely higher crime rates in the black community, more black concentration in cities, which have more and tougher police, so on. So that's another thing that's kind of ignored here. I mean, in a typical year, you might have 15 unarmed African-American men and 65 unarmed Caucasian and Hispanic men killed. The second category is simply ignored, generally. So, I mean, again, if I was talking to a youth audience, I might ask, you know, again, whether or not you think there's some disproportion, whether or not you think there's some racism, we can debate that. You know, 70% of the people killed by police are Caucasian, whites, or Hispanics. Name one. And no one ever can. Sometimes in a working class white environment, someone will name Mr. Tempa, the guy who was shot in the hotel hallway. You get that sometimes in Kentucky. Who's the other? Dylan Noble will sometimes come up. But I mean, in terms of the say their names focus on Alton Sterling and Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and every single one of these guys, many of whom frankly were guilty and some of whom were unarmed only in the most technical sense. But I mean, that as versus the other 70% of the data really is remarkable. And I think that's one of the issues here, by the way, if you want to get beyond race and have kind of a class-based movement for criminal justice. And again, this continues through all people shot by the police. Like the actual data here is widely available. Again, there's a great website, www.killedbypolice.net. Everything I'm saying is pretty easily sourceable, that breaks down police killings, shootings, in and out of custody, et cetera, on a year-by-year basis. In a typical year, about 1,000 people are killed by police. Less than 250 of those will be identified as black. The other 75% will just be white, Hispanic, and Native. And there's some other interesting patterns there. Virtually no Asians are killed by police. So this, again, is a counterpoint to this theme, X has to be due to racism. Of course, there's some residual racism, but why do Asians, Nigerians, other minority groups outperform Caucasians? But anyway, that conversation aside, we do know the data. There are about 1,000 people shot by police in a typical year. About 250 are black. 10 to 20 will be black and unarmed. I think when I talk about the issues with BLM, by the way, I don't think anyone would be opposed to certain police reforms. Like training in how to fight is one that seems obvious to me. I mean, I go to the dojo sometimes, and I don't see why 3 individuals so often seem to have trouble tackling one guy, and so the guns come out. I mean, I think that's something most people would support. Remove some of the immunity provisions from police contracts. That's another obvious idea, qualified immunity. I mean, these were negotiated by the unions in the 70s and 80s. Some of them are completely ridiculous. You can't sue an individual officer unless you go through the entire department infrastructure. So there's work to be done there. But I frankly think that most of the suggestions proposed by Black Lives Matter are absurd because they don't take the data into account. And so they would be terrible for black communities. If you ignore the fact that the total number of people killed by police that are unarmed, that are innocent in a typical year is 10, not 3,000. And then you ignore the fact that 70% of the unarmed innocents are white. They're poor white guys, they're Hispanic guys. So you're focused just on black communities. You end up proposing things that would be terrible, like defunding the police just in black communities. And you're now starting to see cities do that. I mean, New York City cut $1 billion from the police budget, and that's going to most affect areas like West New York, or East New York, sorry, that are mostly black communities. It's not going to be great for Puerto Rican or Italian communities either, by the way. But it's mostly going to affect African-American communities because those are most of the people arguing for this. And I think that the data is painfully clear about what you're going to see as a result of that. I mean, between 2014 and 2017, when the police pulled back for the honorable reasons that Juan mentioned, but they pulled back in black communities after the Ferguson riots, what happened was that you saw murders jump from 14,000 max in a typical year to 17,294. And almost all of the victims, the new victims, were black because working class white communities, Hispanic communities hadn't asked for that pullback and still had the same number of police. So I think that there certainly is a conversation to be had about stopping police abuse. I mean, the George Floyd thing was disgusting, but the question is, how do you actually do that? And I don't think a lot of these activists have any serious ideas to bring to the table other than write me a check.
Yeah, man, you addressed a lot of good things again there. Yeah, I think a lot of nuances. It's really the key is we're lacking nuance in conversation, it seems like, or even nuance in action, really. One of the things actually that it kind of reminded me, I know you mentioned that you were a member of the NAACP. I remember clearly on Twitter, I never really saw the NAACP saying much about the whole, or having much to say about the whole George Floyd movement. I was kind of curious why they weren't stepping in, and I was always seeing BLM stuff, and I'm like, BLM, we've seen them already and how they perform, and it didn't really seem like they had a clear vision. And NAACP has been around for a long time, and I've kind of thought of them as the leading one of the leading black institutions. So they have the experience and kind of the resources to kind of do something with some kind of actions that will actually get something done. Did you notice that as well, or am I just imagining?
No, I think that some of the organizations that I've worked with or that I'm familiar with, NAACP, but also the Urban League, 100 Black Men, I mean, for that matter, allies on a serious civil rights bill, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, didn't have too much to say about a lot of this. And I think that's because a lot of it is pretty complex, honestly. Like, so the George Floyd killing, almost everyone's watched the video. I made myself watch it. And I mean, I do feel that's a disgusting incident that at least theoretically could lead to a conviction for murder. I would have thought immediately after watching it that it definitely would have. But this is where you get into some of the complexity here. The actual toxicology report for George Floyd, and this is when a lot of the more major organizations started pulling back, showed that the amount of fentanyl he consumed was probably pretty near overdose levels. He was also on meth. So I think that the powerful minority business and social science organizations struggle with how to approach this. On the one hand, you hate police brutality, and when you find a remnant of the old enemy, racism, you want to rip that up. On the other hand, in a lot of these cases, the original narrative that's presented turns out not to be real. And I can tell you that officials in some of these organizations, at least at the statewide level, are pretty aware of that. So moving away from the Floyd case, where I do think we'll see justice done. It's just going to be more ambiguous than most people think. Like if you look at the Jacob Blake situation, I mean, this is a situation that was originally described by Benjamin Crump, who's the lawyer in a huge number of these cases, by the way, as a guy who shows up at a female friend's house to break up a fight. He ends up being attacked by the police, essentially for being black, if you read the original presentation, and he's shot 7 times in the back. It turns out that that's not really what occurred. I mean, so Jacob Blake had an outstanding felony warrant for rape. I believe digital, but still rape, not sexual assault. He'd been charged with this. He was a wanted man, and he came back to the house of the rape victim. He was there apparently because in a truly awkward situation, they had a kid together. So he showed up for the kid's birthday party. She didn't want him there, but sort of tolerated it. And he became belligerent and essentially threatened to steal her car, which is apparently something he'd done before. Near the end of the party, there were a couple of kids in the car, and Blake said he was going to take it. So the rape victim calls the police. The police show up at the scene, and Blake starts a physical fight with them. I mean, it looks from the video like he initiated this. So they fight for a couple minutes. He shrugs off a tasing, punches a cop, and then starts to get into the car. And he has a knife, by the way, which is obvious for anyone who's observed the video saw this. You know, he initially was presented by his lawyers being unarmed, but an armed guy getting in here, getting ready to drive off these kids. And the question, I guess, at this point is, do you let this guy take the victim's kids? So the police shoot at him. They hit him twice. They shoot 7 times. And unfortunately, he suffers a disabling injury. I mean, it's a tragic, disturbing case on all sides. But I think if I was looking at that and I were the president of the local urban league, I would really qualify how much I'm going to support Jacob Blake, knowing that the underlying information there's going to come out. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I've been in some of these decision-making rooms, and it's kind of like, you know from the beginning, after Mike Brown and so on down the line, that it's not going to turn out that he was just there to break up a fight and he was murdered by, Klansmen in blue. And what actually happened is pretty much what everybody thought was going to happen. So I do think there's some reluctance to take on these situations. And again, my underlying point is that this is not a major civil rights issue. The number of unarmed brothers shot by cops in a typical year is 10, 20. Of course, that's bad. Those cops should be punished in many of those situations. But this is a distraction from real issues to some extent. Like, there are real issues in the black community. And I'm not what is sometimes called a hereditarian, I think in many cases a racist. I think that the root cause of a lot of this stuff is conflict between blacks and whites in the past, oppression. But as of today, if we were dealing with issues in the black community, I mean, I think number one would probably be crime. There are nearly 20,000 murders again in a typical year. Half of those involve us, members of the African American community. And by the way, 10,000 murders in working class white and Hispanic communities is also pretty striking. I mean, every group in the USA has a murder rate far higher than virtually any country in Europe, including Italy. We've almost caught Russia some years. So I mean, that's a serious issue for all poor Americans, especially black community. Another issue would be fatherlessness. And again, this goes well beyond the black community. The out-of-wedlock birth rate in the USA is 41%, I believe. But for African Americans, we're leading the race. It's like 72%. And there's a bunch of other things you could talk about. I mean, if you want to go left wing, the effects of redlining, if you want to swing back to the right, I don't need to list 10, but like police violence against total innocence is not one of these issues. And I think that there's a reluctance on the part of very serious, even thinking about someone like Diddy, there's a reluctance on the part of people to kind of wave that Jacob Blake flag and then be mocked for a couple of years if it turns out that Blake was guilty. I think there's great consensus among black, white, Latino, et cetera, Americans around things like, let's try to get jobs for everyone qualified. But that's different from a lot of this BLM stuff. Like, there's epidemic interracial crime.
Wow, yeah.
So I did want to follow up because, like, I feel like the narrative of like the media narratives that surround a lot of these cases, like I said, the media's job is to get eyes and people watching and all this other stuff. And I imagine for serious academics that want to study a lot of these things that are happening, you know, you look towards the media to report, right? That's kind of your data set, right? And as a political scientist or historian even, like how do you, I imagine sifting through these events is kind of difficult. And
yeah, that's why I gotta follow Wilfred, because I can't follow any of this stuff usually.
but I wonder how much of that historically is like I guess looking back, how would you say, is there a difference in quality of reporting? Is it like, are we producing more people that are sort of just there's less ethics involved in reporting some of these things? There's not enough due diligence, or what would you say? Like,
yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. So first of all, media is a major problem in the USA right now. And by the way, there's no break given to right-wing media here either. They just report the opposite side of these stories. But for them, it's like illegal alien murders mother. And it's kind of like, how often does that happen? Where are you finding every case of this where like some Latino guy shot like a former beauty queen? I mean, but like, so I'll come at this from both angles, actually. Like another thing that the media, again, left and right media focus on different angles of this. But another thing that the media really overhypes is interracial crime. I mean, so this is something I look at in Taboo. Like, what's the actual rate of interracial crime? And I would peg it at about 3% of serious crime. Specifically, let me clarify, interracial violent crime. But I mean, again, the idea on the left, if you look at these stories about Pool Patrol Paula, Barbecue Becky, Coupon Carl, so on down the line, is that it's very difficult to live as a black person without being attacked by violent whites, frankly. I mean, you had the Central Park dog walker case, like, can't even bird watch without people letting their dogs run free. I mean, like, the two of them are, like, threatening pets and stuff. I mean, that's one hand. And on the other hand, I mean, like, there's actually a website called White Girl Bleed a Lot, which consists of dozens of videos of basically like black people winning fights with white people. Like, black guy knocks out a white guy, or sometimes, like, it's unprovoked. A black guy will hit a white guy with a brick or something.
Wait, this isn't World Star Hip Hop? This isn't just World Star. This isn't just World Star Hip Hop or something.
World Star. No, but I mean, that's another version of this. Like, you just want to see people of different races fight for bullshit reasons. Yeah, you know, I mean, like, I actually once was watching a fight in Chicago. It was between like an Irish guy with like cloverleaf tattooed on his neck and like a big black guy, and they're beating the crap out of each other. This is at a bus stop. I wasn't just like enjoying myself. I was waiting for the bus, and somebody in the crowd just spontaneously goes, "World Star!" And like 15 or 20 people just start breaking up laughing. But anyway, like, there's a whole bunch of this stuff. Both groups think that they are constantly being victimized. The reality is that there are about 20 million crimes in a year. If you look at what's called the BJS report, the Bureau of Justice Statistics annual report, there are 20 million violent crimes, which is generally the majority, and then what are called index property crimes that come pretty close. So you find a burglar in your house. Of those, it takes a while to break this down, but I was genuinely curious. The number of violent crimes, because you often don't know the race of a burglar, that involve either a black perp and a white victim or a white perp and a black victim was 600,000. So like out of 20 million crimes, the number of violent, horrific, interracial crimes, fightings, rapes, so on, was 600,000. That was 3.4% of the serious crimes. Now, and by the way, if you really go into the crime data, like the person most likely to kill you is your wife. I mean, it's very, very different from the presentation in the media of like 5 warriors from another group are going to jump out of a panel van and beat you to death. Or like someone's going to kidnap your kid permanently. Like that stuff almost never happens. But I mean, a very simple question would be, why is the media taking 3% of crime and using this to terrify members of both primary groups affected, as versus virtually anything else that would be as easy to dramatize, like automobile wrecks? And I think the short answer is what you guys said, basically. Certain things get even more clicks. So there's certain stuff like plane crashes, animal attacks, sex stories. Like, there have been 5 attempted murders all time, as far as I can find, where the woman cut off the man's penis, because that requires a certain level of intimacy first. Every one of those became a national story. You know most of their names, like Lorena Bobbitt. So the media does this extraordinary focus on things that are designed to attract clicks, anger, and other than, like, you know, an attack on your wife or something like that, enemy male warriors from the rival group come after me in a number I can't fight is one of those. It's one of those terror stories, but almost never happens. So, I mean, do I think this is getting more frequent? Yeah. And I think the reason for that is the increasingly competitive media environment. So I don't know if you guys fish, but like there are freshwater fish, like largemouth bass, that are great fighting fish. Like they'll put up such a struggle, you sometimes feel noble and just let them go when you catch them. You know, they're dangerous creatures. But none of them match saltwater fish, Dorados and things like that. And the reason for this is that there's more competition in the ocean. You have to move faster, strike harder to live when there are sharks and dolphins and so on around you. And similarly, in the media, you used to have that kind of peaceful inland sea environment. There used to only be, what was it, even when I was a working class kid, like 5 TV stations? Like I remember my mom got a new TV with the rabbit ears on it. We could watch like PBS, like Fox had come into existence. Felt like a baller. Like people would come over. I mean, I'm late 30s and watch this stuff, you know. But I mean, now, what was it? Late 90s, you really saw the rise of good cable. Then you saw the rise of Fox as conservative broadcasting. Then you saw the rise of social media not long after. And right now, if you're CNN, if you're legacy media, you're competing not just with NBC or even Fox. You're competing with like Occupy Democrats. I mean, you're competing with Jacobman's Twitter feed. You're competing with union thugs. So that's going, the paid, not just people. But I mean, so that's going to make you, whether you're aware of it or not, unless you want to lose out in that competitive, you know, oceanic world of business, that's going to make you focus on things that really aren't all that relevant. Like I remember a friend of mine was a junior staffer at the History Channel, like cool, feminist kind of party girl, left-leaning, really liked archaeology, wanted to work for the History Channel her whole life. And she called me almost in tears once and was like, they want me to work on a show about aliens. And it was just like, what? And we talked through it. Like, okay, they're competing in that cable environment, so now they're going to do more of these BS shows like, you know, what if black people sailed to South America? And by the way, I called that one. That came out a couple of years later. You know, the monoliths down there in Olmec country. But I mean, that's what's affecting the media.
Yeah. Because it seems me and Terence have discussions offline, I guess, about these particular things, about how I sometimes feel like the media is you know, I think historically, I forgot which president said this, but it's the fifth column. You know, it's another branch of government in a sense, or like maybe not necessarily government, but I guess the sentiment is
it's got a lot of influence over.
I mean, it's the arm. It's an arm of sort of class control or something. Mm-hmm. I guess depending on whichever lens you take.
Right.
To analyze this, but I ascribe to the position that the media is kind of causing a lot of woes, and I guess in a lot of sense, like it being decentralized, I imagine it's harder for academics like yourself and even your colleagues to sift through all of this information, and I wonder if you have discussions with your colleagues about like, you know, do you walk over to the English department and say, you guys need to have better ethics, that you're pumping out students that are like shitty reporters, or like, you know, like is there any crosstalk, like is there any like how do you what's the narrative around this kind of like phenomenon?
I mean, again, it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. I mean, it's something that, you know, disciplines need to work through outside of a lot of the siloing that goes on. But there's so many problems with even that question itself. Like, for example, a lot of the people that are most affecting modern journalism, I don't think are reporters. I mean, this is one of the things that, and by the way, this is something that's underlying what's going on with social media right now. So on the right, there's this narrative that social media is shutting down conservatives unfairly. I don't actually find that to be true. I find that social media is shutting down influential heterodox voices at the request of mainstream media. That's what's actually going on. Like, if you look at virtually anyone that built up an extremely large new media following over the past couple of years by basically mocking some of the obvious pretensions and corruptions of modern mainstream media, whether that's Milo Yiannopoulos, Minister Farrakhan, all of InfoWars, Chapo Trap House. I was surprised by that one. But I mean, Cop Block, kind of more libertarian than right or left. I mean, they're all gone. A lot of those edge media figures, Laura Loomer, I think Lauren Southern, I mean, their platforms just vanished. You can say some of those people were a little alt-right. You can say some of them were actual communists. But I mean, like, one of the first Libertarian Party pages is gone. You owe blacks trillions is gone. So what's really happening is that people have recognized that these outsider voices had more influence than they did. We saw this the other day when Wall Street Bets got irritated at openly unethical hedge fund behavior, where the hedge funds were shorting the stocks of these beloved American companies like GameStop, BlackBerry, AMC, just to screw them, just to bet low so the stock would drop and then collect that goo-wop. I mean, make a bunch of money if you understand the processes of the market. And so the people on Wall Street Bets, just like the day trading Reddit forum, were just like, what if we bought the stock and drove the price up? So they did. I mean, I'm with them on that, by the way. I'm sorry? Well, actually, I think that this is assuming that it happens again, assuming that they set up like wallstreetbets.kz or .se overseas so it can't be taken down again, like the Pirate Bay, whatever it is now. I mean, assuming that they do that, that they dodge that infrastructure like the pirate sites did, I think this is something that can actually be a check on actual racism when that exists, on cancel culture, which is now more common, on corporate corruption. Like, we could lower the stock of your company to 12 cents anytime we wanted to, say the citizens. I think that may be the final comeback to specifically cancel culture, some of the things we've been seeing. Citizens across party lines are now saying, yeah, maybe not. But at any rate, I think that this sort of thing in the media space is what terrified the traditional players. It was the Milos, the Tim Pools, the Trigonometries, the Ben Shapiros. You can really go on with this. And that's who's being attacked right now. It's not just conservatives. It's not just socialists. It's anyone who challenges that perspective. But the problem is that a lot of these people are still up. I'm not saying that it's a problem in of itself, but like, are the Donald from Reddit just moved to the Donald.win? So many of the people .win, but I mean, so like many of these people that are influencing this conversation aren't reporters per se. Like, even if you're talking about the major left and right sites, not to overuse those terms, that's where a lot of these people fall, like Vox, Bitch, Bust, Jezebel, HuffPo on the one hand, and on the other hand, like Daily Caller, I mean, that kind of thing. Like, how many of the people on those sites have a degree in journalism or a master's in English? Like, I don't know. I'm legitimately not trying to insult them, but I think just, if only because I don't want 50 negative articles about me, like, former corporate thug becomes edgy professor. But like, but just on the real, like, I don't know how improving a master's level journalism program would fix this problem, because so many of the most influential people are just kind of guys with microphones.
Yeah, you're saying it's more of a business, it's now a business front on how to get more eyes, as opposed to sort of ethics. And yeah, but
yeah, let me jump in here real quick. We're kind of running low on time, and I wanted to ask Wilfred one thing, really in particular, about the lockdown. So I really wanted to get more of your take on the lockdown situation, because I've heard you tweet about it a couple times, but I never really got a full. I feel like my mind's not unlocked enough on it, so I wanted to see if you could maybe provide me some more understanding. Is the lockdown dumb? If so, why?
I feel like dumb's a harsh word. You know, I think at the beginning politicians were confronted with, this sort of apocalyptic fear. I think they reacted in a way they thought would save lives. So, I mean, there are people I think handle this very badly, like Cuomo. But I mean, in general, I don't think the initial decision was immoral or stupid or anything. But I bluntly, I don't think lockdowns work. I mean, like, there was a major study of every Western European country that controlled for, I think, 14 different variables, including stuff like temperature, and found that there's no effect of locking down as versus, and this is important, there's no effect of locking down as versus well done masking and distancing. Basically, like, those are the options. So if you look at countries that didn't necessarily lock down, like Sweden or Belarus, they weren't just holding raves full of grandmothers. I mean, like, the idea was, we'll put up the plastic sheets in businesses, give 6 feet, elbow bumps. I mean, mask use was lower than it is here. People were wearing effective Mylar masks. Right. So it's not as though we should just ignore COVID and accept 800,000 instead of 300,000 as the toll. I do think there are people that sometimes imply that in kind of that young male sector, and I think that's a dumb idea. But there's no evidence that lockdowns work better than the standard protections against a disease epidemic, which are hygiene, giving that bit of distance, less physical contact. And another one that people almost forget, staying home if you're sick. Less than half of cases seem to be symptomatic. If you know there's a sort of super flu epidemic going on and you're coughing and wheezing, just stay in your house. I mean, there are protocols that enable people to prevent the spread of disease. I think masking is pretty effective, and that is probably what we should have done. The reason that we didn't actually is something that I say every time I talk about this, and it gets into the important role of the sciences. The reason we didn't is that 3 or 4 specific people, Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, I wouldn't quite call him a scientist in this field, but Pueo, one of the most influential tech executives, the first team to try to redo Ferguson's model, like 3 or 4 people in a row, came up with these incredible doomsday positions that were just wildly wrong. Like, Neil Ferguson estimated that in what you call a moderate control scenario, which is basically the MSD that I described, 1.5 million people, if I have that correct, would die in just the USA by like August. In his scenario where there was no reaction, 2.2 million people would die in just the USA by August. So, and this was based on projections that turned out to be flatly wrong, that the IFR, infection fatality rate, for COVID for everyone, not just for known hospitalized cases, would be 1% or more, that 80% of people would already have the virus by that date. And there are people that have speculated that Ferguson essentially just made some of this up when they looked at the coding for his model, that it would be very hard to do a projection model that sophisticated over that range of time. Ferguson himself had some personal issues that I won't go into detail about after this and has fallen from grace. But that was one of the pitches. Pueo, the tech guy who used his own equip to review Ferguson's projections, said 10 million people would die. You know, all he did really was take Ferguson's paper and say, what if the IFR were 4%? Based on, as far as I can tell, nothing. It now turns out that we knew pretty early on from antibody tests what the actual fatality rate for COVID was. It's about 0.2 to 0.6%. Every serious estimate's fallen in that range. I believe the CDC has said 0.26 and later 0.59. That's what kind of general quants and the sciences are saying early on. Anyway, I don't just want to get to a bunch of blah, blah, blah about math, but the reason we locked down was projections that were wrong, that a lot of people at the time, if you look at Ioannidis' writing and so on, Bhattacharya, I think the first guy's a little edgy, knew were wrong. So I think that this is something, actually, I hope we take a lesson from this for climate change, gun violence, a bunch of other things, which is like, don't deny the problem on the one hand, but also when someone comes to you with what seem like crazy doomsday predictions, ask, you know, how are you getting this? Like, does your climate change model adjust for adaptation? Because if not, it's pretty much worthless. And I'm really worried about what happened with COVID. Like, I don't mind wearing a mask. And in fact, I went out and bought an effective mask, like a Mylar mask, or even an N95 is like $25. But I mean, there were entire states where 90% of the population stayed home for 8 months. I mean, if you look at urban California, because the government said they should, basically, there was no way to enforce that. And given that level of compliance and the level of media presence that we have now, what couldn't you tell people to do? I mean,
one of the things that comes to mind, sorry to interrupt you, but one of the strong thing that comes to mind is Trump. So Trump basically was, I don't know if he actively said not to wear masks, but he made fun of it, made light of the issue, clowned it enough to, I think, a significant portion of his base kind of took that and ran with it. So do you think that there is a significant number of those types who listen to Trump in that sense? Where we could still even come out with this, with not doing a lockdown and just going with the whole, just wear a mask, or would it still have just been, it's too late?
No, I mean, I think that, well, again, I don't think that there's a difference between lockdown and social distancing countries given any attention to distancing whatsoever. Like, my understanding, so like there were some jackasses, mostly young men, that listened to Donald Trump and didn't do anything. But I think, in fact, if you look at the big red states, I mean, the Dakotas, Utah, there are a bunch of states that didn't lock down. And in fact, on average, I wrote a paper about this for America's Majority Foundation, currently prepping it as a journal article, and serious results. And those states in general did better in terms of COVID deaths. They had more cases per capita, if we're being honest, but they had fewer deaths per capita. So no, I don't think it can logically be argued that sort of Republican recalcitrance would have made it impossible not to lock down, for a bunch of reasons. I mean, one would be social pressure. Like, I suspect there are very few diehard Republicans in LA, so people in those blue state environments where people are more concentrated, I'm pretty sure would have been made to toe the line. People were freaking out about masks for a while there in the cities, in Louisville, Chicago, the places I've been to. And I think second, if anything, the data shows that conservatives did not mask as much, obviously, but also gave a little more distance, possibly just because there's more space in those states, but stayed home a little more, protected seniors better. So I'm not sure you would have seen dramatic differences. But one of the things about COVID-19, I'm going to get back to Trump in a second, because there are a lot of antics he engaged in at the end of the presidency that people need to be very honest about. But I mean, one of the things with COVID-19 is that the target pool, the death population, bluntly, was so specific. I remember I read the first paper that came out of Italy, and its headline, average age of Italy's dead is 81. This ran in the India Times. This ran in the Journal here in the USA. And I looked through this and I said, well, maybe there's something specific about the Italians, because the government wouldn't be panicking to this extent if that's going to be what we see overall. Why don't we lock down the nursing homes? I understand you can't totally quarantine seniors, but like 2/3 of the most vulnerable seniors are in nursing homes. Why don't we do that immediately? There must be something else going on. And months later, when I wrote my second COVID paper, I looked at the data and I found the average age of U.S. deaths was 82. Like, the average person who died had something like 6 pre-existing conditions. So again, there was something we could have done very early on that would have eliminated 80% of the deaths here. Like, absolutely no non-medical visits to nursing homes. Like, if you work there, you do have to quarantine. We're going to put a monitor on you. Or you can stay alternating 2-week shifts here. The gestation period's 2 weeks for COVID. They did that in France. Great results in urban France. I mean, so that's what we probably should have done, honestly. Because the pool is so specific, I don't think like healthy young fighting men not wearing masks as long as they're not around seniors really makes much of a difference at all. But that said, like the Trump thing, one thing people in the business world or people that lean a little more conservative have to do is say that Trump did a lot of nonsense near the end of the Trump administration. I mean, like the comment you shouldn't wear masks under COVID, whether or not it makes much of a difference, is not really something you think of as a leadership level move. And this was followed by the claim the election was stolen. You can argue some irregularities. There's no proof the election was stolen. That was followed by his interfering in Georgia, which probably lost the Republicans those Georgia seats. So the reification of Trump, I see from some of the more right-leaning buddies I, for example, would fish with, is a little bizarre. Like, Trump very likely could have gotten reelected if he just stayed on teleprompter through both political debates. And then Georgia would have been a win, and then you'd have a fairly popular GOP president and GOP Senate. So people that are just saying that doesn't matter, that are Republicans, I think are really engaging in some weird kind of cultish behavior. And the Patriot Party, like Trump is probably going to challenge the Republicans in 2024. Like, people that are on that strategic apparatchik side for the GOP need to be aware of that. That said, I think I can see the reason that there was such support for and almost worship for Trump. And it's the same reason that people were cheering so hard for Wall Street bets across party lines. It's the idea, like when we're talking about mass media, that there is sort of a crooked elite that's not really providing proper, valid information. So whether or not you think Trump acted an ass, it's also the case that major media platforms like Twitter literally wouldn't allow you to share his October surprise political story. That like the vice president's son, who's a famous international businessman, was a crackhead. Like, that's a pretty significant story, in my opinion. This was followed by, complete changing of the election rules. It wasn't done illegally, but in the couple of months before the election that led to Trump's loss, that's what caused the stop the steal frenzy, so on. But that aside, should you wear masks if there's a respiratory virus? Yes. Lot in that paragraph. Complex paragraph.
Yeah, Wilfred, I've seen we're at 1 hour and 2 minutes, so man, I wish we had more time. Of course, we're limited by the camera, but man, you have so much good information to take, and I feel like I'm gonna probably listen to this podcast like all week, just internalizing some of these things. But man, if I was just thinking while you're talking there too, I would love to see you talk with Eric Weinstein. I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Weinstein. Sorry?
Yeah, the IW guy.
Yeah, Eric Weinstein. he's another one of our definitely me, one of my big guys who I look to for information on things like this. And I think you guys would make a really good podcast if you got on with him somehow. Of course, I don't know how much time you have to do these kind of things, but I think that'd be a great talk with you, with you and Eric. And he'd actually probably add some information, more than we were able to. But yeah. So I guess anything to wrap up here, Juan, because we're running low on time.
No, it was just very interesting to get your, I guess, just your background and your take on all this.
Did he change your mind on anything?
No, nothing particularly new, but I like having discussions like this because just hearing academics talk about these I would say difficult issues, is
especially
important.
One who's so empirical minded.
Well, I would hope all academics are empirically minded.
Well, maybe, but I wouldn't get your hopes up.
Yeah, but I'm saying I would.
These are rare finds these days.
I would hope that most people who are using statistics and know how to read them.
Yeah, but I'm interested to see also what our audience says. You guys, if you have any questions for Wilfred, I can maybe shoot him a tweet. Wilfred, thanks for coming on the show, man. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, enjoyed talking to you, gentlemen. I'd be glad to talk to Eric. In fact, the questions were all on point when he said, you don't know how much he added to the conversation. I like doing it. Have a great day, y'all.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Cool. See you, bro.
See ya.